Over the past weeks, India has expressed itself in statements, joint statements, and votes at the United Nations on the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict that saw a temporary pause for the exchange of hostages, which began on Friday. Prime Minister Narendra Modi hosted two separate virtual summits, the concluding session of India's G20 and the second edition of the Voice of Global South Summit, and spoke about the ongoing Israel Hamas conflict, as well as the importance of heeding the concerns of the developing world. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar traveled to the UK for talks held along with the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh. 2+2 dialogues with their counterparts from the US and Australia, where joint statements reflected the West's position much more. India's position as articulated since the October 7 terror attacks along the Israel-Gaza border by Hamas that killed more than 1,200 people, and then on the bombardment of Gaza by Israel, where more than 13,000 have been killed, has been multi-layered. The Modi government has condemned terrorism in the strongest language and stood with Israel over the attack, although it hasn't thus far designated Hamas as a terrorist group. The government has called on Israel for restraint, dialogue, and diplomacy and condemned the death of civilians, and along with the US and Australia, called for humanitarian pauses in bombardment but has not so far called for a ceasefire. At the same time, India has reaffirmed its support for a two state solution, including a sovereign, viable state of Palestine, exciting in peace alongside Israel, supported the socio-economic welfare of the Palestinian people, and has sent 70 tons of humanitarian assistance, including 16.5 tons of medicines and medical supplies via Egypt to Gaza in the past month. Mr. Jaishankar said at the BRICS emergency meeting chaired by South Africa this week. Mr. Modi, however, skipped the BRICS Plus summit attended by all other leaders of the 11 nation grouping, indicating a discomfort with the tough line taken by South Africa that has asked for the International Criminal Court to investigate Israel for alleged war crimes in Gaza. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, India abstained at the UNGE vote on October 26 that called on Israel for a ceasefire, but voted in favor of other draft resolutions of the UNGE's Fourth Committee on November 9 against Israel's settler policies in the occupied territories, including the West Bank and Syrian Golan. Traditionally, since its leadership of the non aligned movement, India's position on the Israel Palestine conflict has always aligned with the global South, offering full support for the Palestinian cause. It has called for talks to end the conflict while building a stronger strategic defense, counter-terrorism, cooperation, and trade ties with Israel since 1992, after they established full diplomatic ties since the Kargil War, where Israel provided India crucial and timely shipments of weapons and ammunition. A study of India's statements at the UN showed a softening of language against Israel, including toning down condemnation of Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, although it voted regularly with the developing world to stop the violence. India's vote on October 26, however, was a departure from that where it lined up alongside 45 abstentions, mostly from European countries, rather than the 120 countries, mostly from the global south, which included nearly all the countries of West Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, that voted for the resolution. India also joined the US led formulation of total condemnation of the October 7 terror attack and for humanitarian pauses. ostensibly to allow food, fuel, and water into Gaza in between periods of Israeli bombardment, language that appeared in both its joint statements after the 2 plus 2 dialogues with the US and Australia. India has stood apart from Western countries in that it has not thus far banned Hamas or designated it a terror organization or as the US, UK, Switzerland, and Germany have moved to do. In an effort perhaps to push India to do so, Israel this week announced it was banning the Lashkar-e-Taiyiba, the group responsible for the Mumbai 26/11 terror attacks that included Israeli victims 15 years later. While India's relations with Israel have been increasingly dehyphenated from its ties with Palestine, many experts have suggested that any change in its stance favoring Israel over all other ties with the Gulf and Arab world will be watched closely. Watch country as a rich Each country has a rich history of ties with India. For several years, India has built special ties with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, calculating that the normalization of ties between them and Israel is only a matter of time, as the Abraham Accords showed. As a result, the India Israel UAE US trade initiative and the recently launched India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor hanging on this normalization could be one casualty of the Israel Hamas conflict, which has led to a strong reaction from the Arab League and Organization of Islamic Cooperation. When asked this week, the US Ambassador India, Eric Garesti, accepted that the conflict could pause infrastructure initiatives, but that in the long term, the logic of such plans would prevail. India's ties with Iran, Israel's chief enemy, that have been strengthened by initiatives like the Chahabar Port and the international north-south transport corridor to the Central Asia and Russia would also be affected. If it seems that the Modi government is choosing one side more clearly than the other, Israeli companies have expressed its interests in bringing in nearly a lakh of Indian workers to replace Palestinian workforce in the construction industry. New Delhi has thus far not jumped at the idea, keeping in the mind more than 8 million Indians working in the Gulf countries that could be impacted as well.